Azania Critical Theory pretends to be something original, something that originated on the African continent. It did not. It is nothing but American critical race theory. It's just that with a little bit of African flavor sprinkled on top.
Yeah. There's a lot of animosity towards the current system, saying that it's too protective of minorities, that especially white people in South Africa have too many rights, and we need to move towards a different system that is much more antagonistic or aggressive towards the white minority. Is this accurate?
That's correct. It's portrayed as radical theory, but it really is just an ideology of hatred.
Yeah.
Marxism started out as a theory. Nazism started out as a theory. Today's radical theory turns into tomorrow's grim reality if we don't listen or take heed of the lessons of history.
Willem Gravett, thank you very much. Welcome back. It's good to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Arist.
So, I've been in a bit of trouble recently, and I say this sort of tongue-in-cheek because I see there's some people on X, on social media, who have been calling on the University of Pretoria to sue me for bringing their name into disrepute after speaking about this Azania Critical Theory. And you and I have had a discussion about this earlier, about Azania Critical Theory. Yes. What does it mean? And the backstory here is when I went on Tucker Carlson's show, he asked me about this, because as you know, this was shortly after this video started circulating with this commentator talking about how white people in South Africa are subhuman and so forth.
Yes.
And I was asked about this, and I explained to Tucker that that's actually a theory, or that links to a particular theory that is taught at South African universities. So maybe you should start by explaining again what is this Azania Critical Theory, and then we can take it from there.
Yes, Azanian Critical Theory is definitely taught at South African universities. The three main proponents of this, they call it a philosophy, but it's really an ideology, are Ndumiso Dladla, Ramose, and Joel Mudire, who are all from the Faculty of Law, the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria.
And so this theory is, the way I explain it, and then you can correct me or you can add, is that it is a theory that in a sense talks, among others, about Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is this African idea. It's a Zulu word that goes to, you could say, it's sort of the core of humanity or the essence of being human. I think it means brotherliness or something to that extent. And the argument, or at least part of the argument, is that Ubuntu is the essence of being human, but white people do not have this. Is this what it boils down to?
Yes, that is what Ndumiso Dladla wrote. Ubuntu used to be, we talked about Ubuntu as a shared humanity, but Azania Critical Theory twisted this doctrine so that it now means that white people do not have Ubuntu, and therefore we are not human.
And so, but it's in a sense unique to South Africa, but it's not that unique because there are some American philosophers who talk about this as well. So how does this tie into critical race theory as we know it, or as our American audience knows it?
Azania Critical Theory pretends to be something original, something that originated on the African continent. It did not. It is nothing but American critical race theory, as it was expounded by Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Ebrahim X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. It's just that with a little bit of African flavor sprinkled on top.
Yeah. And so this is where the Azania part comes in. So Azania, explain to us, what is Azania?
Azania is the name that the Azanian critical theorists give to South Africa. So they say South Africa was the name given to this part of Africa by the conqueror, the white settlers, and therefore it shouldn't be South Africa, it is Azania, because Azania means a polity of black people in which white people are only foreigners.
But this phenomenon of extremist ideology and rhetoric taught at universities or celebrated at universities is not only limited to the University of Pretoria. We've seen this with The Roads Must Fall, The Feast Must Fall. And there was this story of a student who finished his master's dissertation with the words, "One settler, one bullet," and he was then celebrated by I think the principal or the vice chancellor.
Yes.
So is this linked? It's not linked only to the University of Pretoria, although this particular strand has largely been developed there, or how?
Correct. No. It shows its face at most universities in South Africa. It's a favored intellectual movement. The radical, the better. It's portrayed as radical theory, but it really is just an ideology of hatred.
Yeah. And there's talk among these people about bringing the what you might call the constitutional order to an end. So there's a lot of animosity towards the current system, saying that it's too protective of minorities, that especially white people in South Africa have too many rights, and we need to move towards a different system that is much more antagonistic or aggressive towards the white minority. Is this accurate?
That's correct. The Azanian Critical Theorists call themselves constitutional abolitionists. So they say that the ANC negotiated from a position of inferiority during 1994, and that what the Constitution actually achieved was simply to entrench white privilege, white superiority. So for South Africa to change, they don't believe in multiculturalism and non-racialism as the Constitution expounds. So for South Africa to end, there must be violent revolution. And the only way that South Africa can end is through violent revolution.
And this then, of course, links to Frantz Fanon.
Correct.
What was interesting to me in my recent discussion with Ben Shapiro, he actually mentioned that this comes from Frantz Fanon. And before the interview, I can say this, when we sat down as we were preparing for the interview, he made the remark, he said that what's happening in South Africa and in some other places in the world appears to him as a rediscovery of Fanon. Fanon was in many ways an unknown philosopher, but he has been rediscovered, or is becoming a rediscovered person, and is becoming increasingly popular among especially leftist radicals.
Correct.
Do you agree with this? And who was Fanon?
Absolutely. He's a favorite of the Azanian critical theorists. Frantz Fanon was a black Frenchman who was born on the island of Martinique, and who qualified as a psychiatrist. And he turned to philosophy, and he came to the conclusion, especially in his works such as Wretched of the Earth, that the only way for black people to be liberated on the African continent is through violence, is through blood and fire.
Yeah. And so I remember his argument. He made a lot of arguments, but one argument was that African people or black people are not treated by white people as human beings. They are treated as animals. And therefore, you do not need to, when there's some form of reciprocity, you do not need to act like a human being.
Correct.
You can act like an animal because these people treated you like an animal.
Exactly.
And so it's also, I mean, certainly there were some grave atrocities on Africa and everywhere in the world throughout history. But the argument sort of boils down to saying that if you are black, then by definition, you are a victim of, by definition, white people. And if you are white, then by definition, you are oppressing black people and inflicting violence upon them. And the only solution then is, you could say, some form of a race war, or at least a violent uprising. And so a lot of people are sort of linking their ideas or founding their ideas in Frantz Fanon, who incidentally is also very popular among the EFF and the EFF leadership in South Africa.
Of course. Yeah. In Azanian critical theory is a very binary ideology. There are only black and white. White, by definition, are racist and oppressive, and black, by definition, are righteous and racist. Black people cannot be racist, according to Azania Critical Theory. So white people are racist not by any individual characteristics, but merely by being white. And so the only way to get rid of racism in South Africa is to get rid of white people.
Yeah, yeah. On the face of it, this doesn't seem like something that is reconcilable with Marxism, because Marxism has a different theory. It thinks in terms of economic structures and hierarchies, but it turns out that it's quite easy for people like this who believe in this sort of race theory to reconcile their idea with Marxism. So what does that blend look like, the race theory with the Marxism?
Oh, the Marxism shows its face in the Azanian Critical Theory's solution for the problems in South Africa. And that is simply classical Marxism with a racialized face. So instead of Marxism defining inequality in terms of class, Azania Critical Theory defines inequality in terms of race. And Azania Critical Theory says that the only way for South Africa to be liberated, for what they call historic justice to be achieved, is for all title to property to revert back to the indigenous population of South Africa. They don't say who that is, but the only thing they do say is that private property ownership by white people will be completely abolished in Azania. And on top of that, nationalization of banks and mines, large-scale reparations and wealth taxes to be imposed on white people. And this stuff could just as easily have been written by Marx. It is nothing but Marxism.
Yeah. So what's concerning is that this is obviously a very extremist idea.
Yes.
And I think it's safe to say that the majority of people don't buy into this.
Yes.
But what is concerning is that it seems that there are few people who are willing to openly criticize this.
Yes.
Especially, you could say, more to the left. And so what I've noticed is, let's use an example. I watched one of these, I think, Jubilee debates on YouTube, where they have these groups debating against each other. And in the American election, in the run-up to the election, there was a group of Democrats and a group of Republicans. And the question was asked, are you concerned about extremists on your side of the political spectrum?
Yes.
And almost all the Republicans said yes, and almost all of the Democrats said no.
Yes.
And so what we do see is it's very easy also in South Africa to talk about the far right. And I think it's also safe to say that moderate conservative people are concerned about the far right.
Yes.
But it does seem that moderate people on the left are either not concerned about this or are not willing to speak out against this.
Correct.
It seems as if it's only people on the right who are concerned about the extreme side of the left. Is this sort of how you see it as well? Or how do we put this Azania Critical Theory in the bigger spectrum, you could say, politically?
Things that we've been seeing recently, and I include in that the chant, kill the boer, kill the farmer, are really populist expressions of Azanian critical theory. It's very easy for people like Tristan Kopp to say Azanian critical theory is just an intellectual framework through which to see inequality in South Africa.
Yeah.
It is, Azania critical theory is really revolutionary violence dressed up in intellectual finery, but at its heart beats repression and revolution and division and destruction. And everything, Marxism started out as a theory, Nazism started out as a theory. Today's radical theory turns into tomorrow's grim reality if we don't listen or take heed of the lessons of history.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And this is something, as conservatives, we can say that Edmund Burke cautioned so strongly against, is the difference between basing your arguments on experience as opposed to theory. And so theory is important. You need to have proper theory. But if your political arguments is only a theory, and your proposition or your frame of reference or approach is that reality needs to comply with my theory, as opposed to my theory needs to comply with reality, it's a very dangerous breeding ground. And we saw this with the French Revolution, but we also see this seems like the world hasn't learned its lesson yet, because we see this with the examples you mentioned, communism, Marxism, and so forth. And still today, this Azania Critical Theory.
Yes.
It's not based in experience, it's based on a theory that dictates what the world ought to be or what the world ought to look like, regardless of the fact that it doesn't really comply with reality.
No, it's completely irrational nonsense.
Yeah.
But it's easy for people in the United States, like the federal judge Richard Posner, to say that, oh, these critical race theorists, those are the people occupying the lunatic fringe of the radical left. That's certainly the case. But in the United States, the people that actually expound this philosophy, critical race theory, are a minority criticizing a majority. In South Africa, it's exactly the reverse. It is a majority that targets a minority. And especially this language of Dladla, that Ubuntu means that white people are not human, is deeply concerning. Because research has shown over and over again that for genocide to happen, the first precondition is dehumanization. So first of all, you take someone's humanity away. That's the first step. And the next step is you take everything else away, including their lives.
Yes, exactly. And I think this is something that, this is one of the many reasons why South Africa is so important to our friends abroad, or should be important, because there are all these pressures in a place like America on concessions that have to be made. And there seems to be this underlying idea among at least some people in a place like America that we must remember that we are the majority and the people calling for this are the minority. And so we need to make certain concessions so that we can achieve some form of equilibrium.
Correct.
Which seems to be based on the idea that if we are not the majority anymore, we are not going to experience this antagonism that we do. And South Africa actually shows that once you become the minority, the antagonism doesn't stop. As a matter of fact, it accelerates. You get more antagonism. Because then the argument is that this is a minority that have disproportionate wealth or disproportionate opportunities. And so the aggression that is leveled against them becomes more. It becomes more intense than when you are a majority.
That is true, and the research actually shows it's when you have, like Azania Critical Theory, the proponents of dehumanization, it's when dehumanization is coupled with an exaggerated sense of victimhood, which is exactly what Azanian Critical Theory is. It portrays black people as forever oppressed, as if 1994 didn't happen. According to Azania Critical Theory, we're exactly in the same position we were in 1652.
Yeah, and that's why we hear the argument in South Africa that we need at least 350 years of black economic empowerment, because which is just race laws aimed at discriminating against white people, because white people arrived 350 years ago. But I'm pretty confident that if we were able to sort of fast forward in time up to 350 years from where we are now, if there is not some form of perfect equality of outcome, which obviously there wouldn't be because that's not realistic, then the argument would be, well, our work isn't finished, so perhaps we need another 350 years.
Yes, but if you look at black economic empowerment, just the disaster it has wrought in the last 30 years. Now fast forward or expound that, extrapolate that 350 years further. South Africa wouldn't exist in 350 years if that was the case. Because you have to understand, for Azanian Critical Theory, it's not just that black socialism is the answer. It's that capitalism, which they equate with racism, has to be destroyed. So instead of market capitalism, the solution for South Africa, it's going to be black socialism. That's the solution.
And so we might go even further by saying that the solution is destruction.
Correct.
That we will get to the building and the production once we have achieved the destruction. But for now, let's not focus on what we need to do to create jobs and to create an economy in which people can flourish. Let's just focus on all the things that we need to destroy and how we're going to destroy it.
Absolutely. Azanian Critical Theory is not about mending relationships and broken systems in South Africa. It's about ending South Africa completely so that a black socialist utopia can be built on top of the ruins.
Yes. And so if this, I mean, this is obviously a very extreme idea. And I went to the University of Pretoria. You were a lecturer at the University of Pretoria, and there are very good people at the university.
Yes.
What concerns me is that the university doesn't seem to be taking a stance against this. Why has this become so, you might even say, entrenched, even though it's a very extreme view?
It's because it's a very extreme form of woke ideology, and woke ideology is all the rage in academia. And one would have thought with the election of President Trump that woke is at an end. And it may be true that the tide is turning somewhat, but our institutions, universities, are still very much entrenched in far leftist ideology.
And so you are now with Akademia. So
Yes.
I should ask this: do you think the idea of a university is something of the past? Should we abandon hope for universities, or is there a way forward for universities?
No, there's for sure a way forward for universities, and that is to embrace the classic Western liberal idea of what a university was supposed to be.
And what is that?
Is to teach students. Actually, they come there for knowledge, so give them knowledge instead of ideology.
Yeah. And so I think we spoke about this before, but something that when I heard this the first time as a first-year student, I thought this was incredible, very good idea. But having spent some time thinking about this, I have become increasingly concerned about this. And it's the idea of critical thinking.
Yes.
So it's something that universities take pride in, that they teach students critical thinking, which obviously is a good thing because you need to be able to think critically. But it does seem concerning that critical thinking can reach a point where it becomes destructive. You are just critical of everything.
That's right.
And there's nothing that needs to be preserved. There's nothing that needs to be cherished.
Yes.
And we see this in humanities, but we see this in theology and so forth as well. And I think that's part of the point that you're making about when we base university life or education in a Western tradition, the essence of that, to me at least, seems to be that we need to be able to think critically, but there's something that we have inherited, there's something that we need to preserve.
Correct.
And that we need to be grateful for. Is this how you see it?
Critical thinking, as people in the traditional Western liberal tradition think about it, is thinking critically even about your heritage. Critical thinking in leftist ideology is really not critical thinking at all. It's not self-critical. It's just critical of everyone and everything else, to the point that everything else has to be destroyed.
So what you are saying, do I understand you correctly, is that, and it makes sense, that critical thinking as it has become, or the monster that it has become, is still called critical thinking, but it's not critical at all.
It's not critical at all.
You're not able to criticize critical thinking,
No,
for example.
That's exactly it. If you criticize critical thinking, you're automatically branded a racist or a white supremacist.
So it's a one-way thing. You can only be critical in a particular direction.
Correct.
Yeah. So I want to segue into something that you mentioned in passing, is this Tristan Cup story, because it was a story in the news now in South Africa, and maybe you can just explain how it works for our viewers, because it went viral very quickly. Now, I'll explain it from my perspective, and then you can comment on that. I didn't know who this person was. I have heard the name before, and it turns out this person is an academic at the University of Pretoria. And this person accused me, after I think the discussion I had with Tucker Carlson, of promoting toxic ideas, toxic theories, or something like that. And it turns out then, when the story came out about this person criticizing what I've said, it came out that this person is a self-proclaimed Satanist, and that he is involved in some way with the Faculty of Theology at the University of Pretoria. Yes. And so the story was not this person is criticizing Ernst. The story was there's a Satanist at the university, and he's in some way linked to the theology faculty. Now, I initially interpreted this as that he was a lecturer, which I then corrected. I said, no, it turns out he's not a lecturer, but he is still involved. He seems to be a research associate. Or how does that fit in with the bigger scheme of things?
I don't know Dr. Kopp's particular circumstances, but the way that it usually works is that when you complete a doctorate and you don't go out and get a job and leave the university, you can stay on as a research associate, and that can mean different things. One thing it definitely means is that the university then gets the benefit of anything you publish. So the university gets a subsidy from the government for academic articles published, and if you're a research associate, the university gets that benefit. But it may also mean that the person you're working with, the lecturer or the professor you're working with, may ask you to teach some courses, to tutor some students, to mentor some students. But I don't know what Dr. Kopp's personal circumstances are.
And I do know that he did something to that effect, because I have seen videos online of him lecturing, presumably at the university.
Yes.
I know at the university because I think he has said that it was an extracurricular lecture,
Yes,
where he was providing lecturers on Satanism. So what does it mean if it's an extracurricular lecture? Because it's still at the university.
It's at the university. What happens is universities often would present research talks or get someone from outside to give a talk to students, and that may very well be the context in which this happened. It was a research discussion. Yes.
Now, I think in defense of the faculty and the churches involved there, I think it's safe to say this person doesn't speak for the faculty. Or the churches who are lecturing students there, and I know I've seen some of them have issued public statements about this. But it's still concerning, and I mention this because it links to the broader point that we've been discussing about this approach to critical thinking, which has become this one-way thing. And I mentioned theology as a good example of where this can go off the rails, because theology should be about learning about the divine and appreciating the divine and trying to discover it and make sense of it. But if you are only driven by the idea of being critical, then, and you approach theology from that perspective, then you have to be critical of the divine.
Correct.
And you have to, and that eventually leads to Satanism, sort of figuratively speaking, but in this case, perhaps literally, actually to Satanism.
Yes, it's law. Theology becomes anti-theology. The divine becomes anti-divine. The law becomes anti-law, which is really what the proponents of Azanian critical theory wants, because they view the legal system in South Africa as violent, as white law, and as not being able to address any of the issues that black people face.
As something that that has to be brought down.
Correct.
And so, what advice do you have for students? Because I, again, as I said, I was a student at the University of Pretoria. I have had some experiences. I was at the law faculty, but it was before this was taught there. At least during my undergrad studies. But I've also had some experiences with lecturers, especially more on the philosophy side, who have some really far out ideas. And I remember once ending off a paper with a note saying, I've written this piece or this essay because I think that this is what you want me to write, but I want to state for the record that I do not agree with what I have written.
Yes.
How should a student approach this?
I would encourage students, all students at all universities, to be critical, to actually be critical in the Western liberal tradition sense of the word. Don't accept anything your lecturers tell you necessarily at face value, especially if it's passed on as jurisprudence or philosophy. It may very well just be ideology. And so I encourage students to read broadly, to listen broadly to a lot of voices and make up their own minds.
And you could even say, as you mentioned now, disagree with your lecturer, because I think if the lecturer is worth his salt or her salt, they would welcome it if a student disagrees with him. And if your lecturer becomes angry at you, maybe that's an indication also that just of the lecturer itself.
Exactly. It's very gratifying when students come to you and they disagree with you or argue with you, and you can see that they've actually engaged with the material and that they're thinking deeply about the material. That's why we teach, and that's very gratifying.
Yeah. Well, Willem Gravett, thank you very much. It was great to have you on the show.
I just want to, if I can, Ernst, end with a quote from George Orwell.
Oh, please.
George
yes.
Orwell wrote in 1946, in light of, or just after these Nazi atrocities of the Second World War came to light, and Orwell wrote, "Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind." And this is what, in my view, Azania Critical Theory is.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you support this initiative and you want to contribute to the work that we are doing, I want to encourage you to click on the link in the description and to sign up as a contributor.